what are some of the extremist groups like you've kind of documented during your career?
Yeah, so I will. I'm happy to share one that comes to mind, but I will say that in general, I try not to attach the term extremist to any
Fair.
particular group.
That's fair.
So I
That's fair.
cover the extremities of American politics because the most extreme people about anything, right? Some are going to be represented by themselves going out onto the street. But in some ways, the people you're documenting are very much a part of the American democratic process, and so I think that the label of extremist, in some ways, it might escalate them, but in other ways, right? It could be argued that they're actually quite representative of sort of what's going on or the direction things have gone. Right? Some people would argue that Bernie's followers are extreme. Some people would argue that Trump's followers are extreme. Right? Like, so it all depends on perspective, but. I will certainly say that, like, filming in Charlottesville, for example, really brought, I think, a coalition of the most extreme groups. So the concept of that event, it had been titled Unite the Right. And in theory, what it was supposed to do was unite basically hard right groups that were apathetic about like race to groups that were explicitly neo-Nazi, white nationalist, the types of people chanting "Jews will not replace us" and "Free Dylan Roof" and just extremely, like, wildly racist points of view. And what was sort of interesting about that situation, beyond, of course, the tragedy of the amount of violence and death that occurred, but in terms of political coalition being something that I really focus on, sort of studying who is capable of going out and working with who else, and what issues can they set aside for what joint issues, right? Unite the Right in Charlottesville was supposed to bring together all of these different diverging perspectives of the far right, but the leading up to it, as certain groups such as the Proud Boys found out what kinds of other groups were going to be there, the hardcore neo-Nazis and so forth, and they didn't want to be associated. What kind of happened leading up to it is that the groups perceived as less extreme sort of shaved off of it, and so that it was largely groups that were just openly happy to be labeled white nationalists and were, white nationalists and neo-Nazis and so forth that showed up, and those handful of people who, even if they don't identify with those labels, they felt fully well what they were attending.
Yeah.
And it also had the opposite ultimate effect from what the organizers were trying to do, because with their claim being that the event is to unite the right, in reality, following what happened there was violence that took place, but there weren't, and people died, but speeches weren't given, and people were finger pointing over essentially the failure of organizing that had led to that mayhem. And so in the aftermath of it, as these guys are getting arrested and some are going to prison, they're getting sued into oblivion. And actually, more recently, a civil lawsuit basically accusing them of conspiring to commit civil rights violations based on race. Succeeded. And so, basically they now have financial judgments against them. It's really led to them actually finger pointing at one another over why it happened. And so so if you keep track of the people who actually attended sort of as leadership at that event, many of them spend their time blaming the others, saying, he's responsible for the event, or he's responsible for it going wrong or turning violent or whatever. And so it really had the opposite effect. And whereas the alt-right was getting all of this media attention, the New York Times is writing these sort of silly stories like the neo-Nazi next door and making observations about, wow, this neo-Nazi, he eats dinner and has a wife like other human beings. Like, look how interesting, right? Like, that was kind of their payday. That was their at their most popular. All the media is talking about them. And then following Charlottesville, the conversation about them was pretty much exclusively tied to Charlottesville, and they no longer were kind of cool, even in their own eyes. Their movements basically fell apart. Some of them managed to rebrand, but for the most part, that fell away. And in the time after that, groups that were of the hard right, even groups that were pretty open and proud about their participation in street violence, managed to succeed when they distanced themselves from the alt-right. So I would basically say, for example, the Proud Boys exploded in membership from 2018 through 2020, and then essentially up until January 6th, where they were saying, look, we have an Afro-Cuban, chairman. We are civic nationalists. We fight for America, but we're not racist, is what they would, say in the media and so forth. And that was a message that kind of got them much more included in the Trump group, right? The Trump supporters were like, those people at Unite the Right, like that, we've never seen anything like that. That's not part of us. The Proud Boys are welcome with open arms at Trump events. And so that kind of shift in the rhetoric of who was out on the streets seemed to really change. And of course, it changed again after January 6th.
Yeah. You corrected me, and I thank you for that, because that is a piece of rhetoric that I'm using. Extremist groups, like, I don't know any of these people. I haven't done the research on these groups, right? I'm not as versed. I think that's very, very important. Language is very, very important, and so I appreciate you doing that, man. Because I don't. The whole ethos of this show are things are stranger than they seem, and that you need to look into things and try and understand one another and talk, right? I think that's super important, which kind of brings me to the next point, whereas